1 Peter chapter 4 is where we're at this morning. Last week we spent quite a bit of time talking about the section beginning in verse 12 where Peter tells them to not be surprised about sufferings that they're going to deal with. We talked a lot about what that means to us. Today we're going to pick up in verse 15. Basically what Peter concluded was whatever kind of suffering. He doesn't really go into details about exactly what kind. But his point to these Christians is whatever kind of suffering you are dealing with or going to deal with, he says that's a blessing. Not so much that you're suffering, but that your suffering is a following in the example of Christ, and that because you're suffering for being a Christian, not for anything wrong that you've done, but for being a Christian, that itself is a blessing, because you are still being a Christian, even in the suffering. So in verse 15, he continues that theme, but he also wants us to make sure we understand that, yes, it's good to suffer as a Christian, or it's a blessing, but you got to make sure that you're suffering just for being a Christian. He says in verse 15, "By no means let any of you suffer as a murderer, or thief, or evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not feel ashamed, but in that name let him glorify God. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore let those also who suffer according to the will of God entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right." So he's already said that the suffering is a blessing. So, in other words, as we suffer, we need to reinterpret that as a blessing to us. But he also wants to make sure that we're suffering for the right reason. He says in verse 15, he wants to make sure, by no means, so absolutely not, don't suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or even, mine says, as a troublesome meddler. Yes, busybody. We'll get to that in a second. So there's a big difference in the way that Peter is presenting this. There's a big difference between suffering because you're a Christian, just because you're a Christian, and suffering for any of these reasons. We talked about this last week, or a couple weeks ago, that a couple of decades after Peter wrote, there was an occasion, I believe somewhere in Bithynia, somewhere in the area that Peter was writing to, where someone was accused of being a Christian. And he was brought up in front of the Roman judge, he was put on trial, and the judge asked him, "Are you a Christian?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And the judge said, "Okay, away with you to the lions." That was the end of the trial. He admitted that he was a Christian, he was guilty, and away he goes to the lions. And one of the spectators stood up and said, "Wait a minute. Why did you judge him guilty? He's not a murderer, he's not a thief, he hasn't done anything wrong. Why are we condemning him to death?" And the judge responded, "Hey, well, are you a Christian?" And the spectator said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "Okay, officers, arrest him, take him off to the lions." A third man stood up and said, "Wait a minute. That guy wasn't doing anything wrong. This guy just asked a question. Why are we sending these guys to jail, to the lions?" And the judge said, "Are you a Christian?" And he said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Okay, officers, take him off too." So, in other words, that example is a case where 3 different people were accused of being Christians and sent to death for no reason other than that they were Christian. In fact, several people pointed it out in the course of the trial that there was no other reason that these people could be considered any sort of deserving of punishment except that they were Christians. They had committed no crime other than being a Christian. So Peter says, according to Peter, that's a good thing. That is exactly how it should be. He wants to make sure that you don't suffer because you've done any of these sort of things. So there's a big difference between that sort of thing. Now, that Clark, yours said that a busybody here. Mine says troublesome meddler. And yours says busybody.
Well, it also says meddler. No doubt.
A busybody or a meddler? Okay, all right. Yeah, that word is, it encompasses all of those things. Busybody, meddler. He puts it in a kind of a little bit of a classification by itself. You know, a murderer, thief, evildoer, these are all pretty major sort of bad guys. Or even, it has the sense of even as a busybody, a meddler. Somebody it means somebody sticking their noses in other people's business. So, certainly we would all agree that you shouldn't be a murderer or a thief or so whatever. But Peter says, that's good if you can't do that, but you don't even be meddling in other people's business. That in itself is bad enough and really classifies it right up there with this kind of thing. So he wants to make sure that these Christians are behaving properly, that they have the right attitude towards each other, that they have the right attitude towards the society around them, that they don't take the freedom that they have in Christ to say, well, we don't need to keep the laws, the ordinary laws of the society that we live in. So this is important to Peter, that these Christians behave themselves properly. Debbie?
I think that troublesome meddler might be a little stronger than just like sticking your nose in someone else's business.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are private, but if you're just trying to get to know them, or I don't think that would be the same as being a troublesome meddler. I think if you're a troublesome meddler, you'd have some kind of like stirring up trouble goal, not just, I don't know, it's not, you don't have good intentions when you're being a troublesome meddler. You're not just wondering about somebody, or you don't have a good heart about it.
Right. Yeah. This is someone that's causing problems. If you're, I guess you could, if you have that question, am I concerned about people's business, or am I being a troublesome busybody? Well, if the way that you have of trying to help people is causing trouble and dissension and anger, then you're overdoing it. And that's what Peter wants them to not do. It does seem kind of odd that he would throw this kind of stuff in here. These are Christians he's talking to. These are not people that haven't followed or haven't accepted Christ. So why does he have to tell Christians not to murder or steal? That's an odd sort of question. These Christians that are actually doing this, or does he think that they might do this, and so he needs to make sure he warns them about it? What it really comes down to, maybe they're doing this, or maybe they are capable of doing this. One of the things that we see from Peter throughout this letter is that Peter is very practical. Peter does not have his head in the clouds. Peter does not think that these Christians are some sort of perfect people, that they are incapable of doing bad stuff. And Peter says, when you deal with the world, make sure that the way that you act doesn't give them any excuse for arresting you, for treating you as a criminal. For example, make sure you don't murder and steal and rob. So make sure that when you get called up and accused of some crime, that the only crime that they can accuse you of is being a Christian. Not being a Christian murderer or a Christian thief, but the only crime that they can accuse you of or convict you of is being a Christian. Steve?
Yeah, I think using these examples, I think he's just showing the degree of sin.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. All right, so verse 17, or 16. So, if he's suffering as a Christian, not for this sort of thing, but for this sort of thing, if you're suffering as a Christian, there's no shame, he says, attached to that. Now, for them as for us, anytime you get hauled up in front of the judge and accused of some crime, that's a moment of shame. Honorable, law-abiding, God-fearing people don't get called up in front of the judge. But they do, because they're Christians. And so he tells them, look, if that happens, because you're a Christian, not because of this, but because you're a Christian, that is not a moment of shame. So don't be ashamed if you do have to suffer because you're a Christian. That's the key here. All this suffering is happening for the sole reason they're suffering because they are Christians, not for anything else that they have done. He says in verse 17 that the judgment is going to begin with the household of God, and then he makes the point, well, if it's hard to save the righteous, it's even harder to save the unrighteous. This idea of judgment is not so much the idea of being judged and found wanting, being found that you judged and you didn't measure up. This judgment, at least of these righteous people, is more the idea of you're being judged and found to be righteous. That's the connection with the suffering that he's already talked about. You're judged righteous because Christ has saved you. You've become a Christian, you've been saved by Christ, you have accepted Christ, you've held on to Christ. And so in that sense, when you're judged, this is a positive message, in other words. You're being judged and found that yes, you have Christ, Christ has saved you. It makes you, the righteous person. He says that it's difficult to save the righteous. Well, that's certainly true. It's hard even for the righteous to save faith. We Christians want to be faithful. Christians back then wanted to be faithful. But even for us, it's hard. And we live in a country that's, in a world that's pretty tolerant of Christianity. I know we look around and say, well, there's this and that happening that makes it hard, and it's true. But Christians don't get beheaded here, at least in the United States, for being a Christian. They do in other parts of the world. And so if it's hard for us to stay faithful, imagine how hard it is in parts of the world where that kind of thing happens. And it happened back then too. It was hard for those people to stay faithful. It's hard to stick with what you have agreed to do. And of course, it's going to be even harder for the sinner. So in other words, the suffering for the sinner eventually, with the return of Christ, with the final judgment, is going to be greater than any suffering that you Christians are dealing with right now. So the fact that you're staying faithful, basically you're going to get much less suffering than any other kind of suffering that you might get. So we conclude that thought in verse 19. Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God entrust their soul to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. So back to this suffering here. That suffering is going to lead you to entrust your soul to a faithful Creator, a faithful God, in other words, and that God's going to save your soul. He's going to preserve your soul. In other words, all this suffering that you're dealing with, and again, he hasn't told us exactly what kind of suffering it is, but it's some kind of suffering, which means we can put in whatever kind of suffering we're dealing with. Whether it is persecution, whether it is milder sort of suffering, whatever kind of suffering you deal with as a Christian, because you are a Christian, or as a result of being a Christian, is going to pay off. In other words, it's going to I don't want to say that he's going to reward it like a payment sort of thing, but there is going to be, it's going to be worth it. It's worth doing the right thing.
Yeah, with that, ridicule being a form of suffering.
Sure. You get ridiculed for being a Christian, that would be absolutely. So, suffering and staying faithful are part of following the examples of Christ. That's another theme that Peter has hit on a lot in 1 Peter is following Christ. Everything that we do is following the example of Christ. When we suffer, we're following the example of Christ. When we stay faithful, we follow the example of Christ. Peter is all about following the example of Christ. So we want to make sure that we don't let our suffering deflect us away from Christ. All right, that finishes up chapter 4. Any questions or comments about the sufferings and following the example of Christ that you've been getting at here today?
Verse. I like the word evil.
Verse 15.
Yeah, okay. And the reason I like that is because it's consistent with Ephesians chapter 5, which says, let no filthy communication come out of your mouth. Evildoer has a large blanket.
Yes,
all right. And so to me, it validates that the book is of God, to have the foresight to use language that covers everything.
Sure.
You know, oftentimes you hear people say, well, you know, I like that Bible, but that was for people back then.
Right.
But when you see terms like that, you understand that the thought behind the mind that wrote this, I don't think man could consistently do that to where, say, don't do this, but, you know, not to think outside. Like, for example, I think this is the third time Peter was accused of following Christ. He's denying him and says he's cursing up a storm. Well, we don't know what words he used, but they were probably way different from any words we use today. So the writer could have just simply said, don't use this word, and this word, whatever was the prevalent at that time, but instead say, let no filthy communication come out. So for him to say, no evildoer, that's going to cover a whole bunch of stuff right there. And to me, it just shows the wisdom of God who breathed the word. And then the other thing is that what Peter's saying here is consistent with Hebrews chapter 12, where he says that if God loves you, he's going to chasten you, you know, and that if you're educated properly, it'll yield a peaceable fruit. So oftentimes we're getting bent out of shape. I give you an example. I was speaking in Chattanooga, and after I finished speaking, a guy came up to me and he said, well, I mentioned how I lost everything when I left from Virginia to Michigan. And he said, you know, I had a similar experience. I said, how did you stay so positive? And I said, because of the Word of God. I said, because I realized that God, A, God loved me, and B, there was an education to be found in losing everything. And then I told him also, I said, from a study point of view, I said, I downloaded videos of the life of Joseph. And I kept looking at those videos every night to remind myself there was somebody who didn't do nothing wrong and still got hit upside his head. But eventually he became a leader, you know, able to save, you know, his whole family, his whole race, you know, everything. So I said that helped keep things in perspective. So if we look at what Peter's saying, yes, suffering hurts, because that's what Hebrews 12 says. It doesn't feel nice, it's painful, but in the end it yields a peaceable fruit. And if we have that attitude, then we won't be so down or depressed or messed up when something doesn't go our way.
One of the big things about the whole Bible, but that we're seeing here and Peter, is that it's addressed to ordinary people. We're not talking to super Christians. We're not talking to saints. We're not talking to ancient people that are way different from us. We're not talking to aliens that are, you know, completely odd from us. We're talking to ordinary people, and they have exactly the same problems that we do. They have people that are murdering. They have people that are stealing. They have people that are just too interested in other people's business. That's the kind of people that Peter is talking to, which happens to be the same kind of people we are today. So you can read through Peter, and even though it was written almost 2,000 years ago, it turns out it applies just exactly as well today.
Jay last week was bringing up the background, are we suffering, or should we be suffering? He was talking about it here as if we're Christians, so we should be suffering. So he was talking a little bit about, we were talking about Christianity. There are another bunch of people that do really suffer for their life and education, but this we might not suffer like this. I was thinking it's so good to know this. We don't know what's going to happen in the future in this country or for our children. Someday, here,
Indeed, a good example to us of whatever place or time or situation that we are in. We stay faithful. All right, chapter 5. Let's go ahead and get into that and see how far we can get through chapter 5. Peter says, therefore, because of all the things we just said about suffering and doing what is right, he says, therefore, I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elders, and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with equal, nor yet lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of the Lord. You younger men likewise, be subject to your elders, and all of them, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So here, Peter is going to address some instructions to the elders. Now, when we hear the word elder, we think of the office of elder. A person who has been officially granted authority and responsibility for the leadership of the church. That, I think, is what Peter has in mind here, but that's not only what Peter has in mind here. The idea of elder, as we see in the New Testament church, is really an extension of an idea that already existed among believers. In fact, we see it as far back as the Old Testament. A number of times when Moses was leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, God would tell him something that he needs to do, some change that he needs to make, some direction that God has for him. And Moses would call for the elders of the people. And that's then and really on into through Israel's history. Those weren't really an office. They were just the old men of the tribes. The men who, by dint of their age, by their experience, by the way they have conducted themselves as the tribe has observed them over time, they have a certain reputation among people, a certain gravitas is the word we use. And it's just that sort of, we look at this man, he's an older man, he's got a lot of good experience, he's got some leadership ability, and the rest of the tribe, the younger people, look up to this man. He doesn't have an official authority, but just because he is an elder man, everybody looks up to him. And so when we get to the church takes that idea and actually adds on an official title. So we have the idea of the official elders, but it's also just the idea of those elder Christians among you who are leading the church even in an unofficial way. So don't, in other words, don't just restrict it here to guys who actually have a title of an elder with a capital E. Peter says to all of these elders, I exhort you as your fellow elder. Now I find it interesting that Peter doesn't say, as the Apostle Peter, I have some instructions. He says, as your fellow elder. So Peter himself is an older man in the church, respected by the community of Christians. And in that position, he wants to talk to the other elders. Right, we didn't think of him as young because we mostly encounter him in the Gospels. In the Gospels, yes, he is young. He's about Jesus' age, somewhere in his early 30s. By this time, it's much later. Let's see, I think we decided he was writing somewhere around late 40s or 50s AD, which would make him about 20 years older, maybe 30 years older than he was in the Gospels. So 50, 60 years old, something like that. So yes, by this point, he is an elder in age, as well as authority. So these elders are leading the church in a very difficult time. We talked about the suffering they're going through. We talked about the possibility of persecution. We talked about the fact that just being a Christian was a very suspicious thing in the eyes of the Romans. One of the things that I was reading about not too long ago said that Christians had the habit of meeting in the morning before it was light. Well, they had to because they had jobs. Jobs would start at sunup. So the only time that they could have to get together would be before light. Well, the problem is, for the rest of your neighbors, for Roman society, when they hear of a group of people who get together secretly, but it was not out in the open. In the dark, at night, what kind of people tend to do that? Criminals do. People who are up to no good. So those kind of people are the ones that are getting together. And so people are, really everything about the church is at least suspicious to the Romans around them. And so these elders are leading the churches in a difficult time, in a time when people are really going to struggle to stay faithful. And you're going to be, you elders, you're going to be putting yourself out there in a position that could be dangerous. Because obviously, if persecution is going to come, the best way to destroy a local congregation is to arrest the leaders. The rest of them are going to follow, are going to not be able to keep going if the leaders are arrested. So he wants to make sure that these guys keep going. He says he's a fellow elder. He's a witness of the sufferings of Christ. Obviously, that means a little more coming from Peter than from the other apostles. Because not only was he there with Jesus the whole time of his ministry, he was what? The very first apostle. First disciple. One of the very first. So he spent more time than most with Jesus. He was also one of only two that went with Jesus to his trial. And we know that he didn't stick around because he didn't deny Jesus. But still, he saw more of Jesus' sufferings than anybody else except for John. So he's certainly one that can say that. And he says he's a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. He doesn't tell us what that is, what exactly that is, but he does say that he and these elders to whom he is writing are going to be a partaker of some kind of glory. So in other words, those who are leading, apostles, elders, there is some amount of reward that is coming to them, some sort of glory for leading the church. So there is some, again, it's not really supposed to be sort of do it so that you can get rewarded, but having that, there is a reward. Verse 2, he tells them to shepherd the flock. Sheep get used a lot in the Bible as a word to refer to the people of God. The Old Testament does that a lot, and the New Testament just continues that idea that the people of God are sheep, and they need shepherds to help take care of them. And so he tells these elders to shepherd the flock of God among them. And he tells them how to do it. Exercise oversight, of course, but that tells them in this oversight, you shouldn't be doing it under compulsion. So don't do it under compulsion. Of course, the opposite of that would be voluntarily. I was thinking about this last night. Peter's almost certainly running a small church. Little churches are so small. Churches that might well be meeting in somebody's home. And so there might only be 5 or 6 or 10 people that are in any particular church. Which means with that small of a group, you're going to have very few elder quality men who are capable of doing this. And yet, Peter says, don't do it under compulsion. It is certainly not unusual in a small church. If you've only got maybe 2 or 3 guys, men that are capable of being an elder, that one of those doesn't want to be an elder, doesn't have the desire. And yet, he looks around and he says, well, if I don't, who else is going to? So I have to do it in order to give the church the leadership that it needs, which is admirable. But Peter says, that's really not the kind of elder we want. Don't do it under compulsion. Do it voluntarily. He doesn't want reluctant elders, elders that serve because there's nobody else, elders that are pressured into doing it. I've heard that happening, where a church pushes a guy to be an elder because they want an elder, even though he doesn't want to. Or one that just serves in some sort of begrudging way. So do what he has to do. That's not the kind of elder that Peter wants. Exactly. He needs to be motivated himself to serve as an elder. He He tells them to do it according to the will of God. According to the will of God. Which is, again, a really important theme in 1 Peter. The example of Jesus, he just talks about that so much throughout 1 Peter, that it's all about the example of Peter, or of Jesus. And of course, when you're thinking about leadership that Jesus showed, you might think of Jesus' example in John 13, where that was at the Last Supper, and John's the only one that tells us this story. But John says that after they finished eating, Jesus got a bowl of water and a towel, and he went around to every single one of the 12 disciples who were sitting there, and he washed their feet. And then he got up and he said, "Do you know why I did that?" And he explained, "I did that because I wanted to demonstrate servant leadership. Just as I washed your feet, even though I'm Lord and Master, and you guys acknowledge me, and I'm Jesus Christ, Messiah, even though I'm all those things, I washed your feet. So you guys, the way you need to talk to each other, deal with each other, is the servant sort of attitude. I can do it, and you definitely can do it with each other."
In the will of God, I think Mary was a good example.
Mary was absolutely a good example, as we saw last week in Jay's sermon. So the example that Jesus gives to the elders, and Peter, I think, is calling us to remember, is absolutely servant leadership. That you are looking not to lord it over it, as he's going to say in the next verse, but to serve in your leadership. Not for gain, he says. So there's apparently a lot of things going on here. So not for gain, which suggests that there were some elders in various churches that had some authority, that had this office of an elder, but were abusing it, were being paid, which that itself is not bad, not wrong. Paul told us a couple of times that it's perfectly good, not acceptable to pay an elder for his service. But apparently they were getting paid and then using that pay in some fashion. He says here, if you're going to be an elder, don't do it to get rich. Don't abuse that payment that you're getting. Apparently some of them are doing it. He says don't lord it over your churches. Which again is the exact opposite of that servant leadership that Jesus gave to them. Don't lord it over those allotted to your charge, but the example to the flock. So Peter's got a lot to say to these elders. He doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but he does pack a lot into the oversight that he expects them to have. Again, he's addressing them not as an apostle sitting up on high, examining all the hundreds of churches across the world, but I am another elder. Superior one, it's true, but still, I'm in here as an elder. And just like you, I understand what it means to be an elder. I understand the struggles that you go through. This is the way that you need to do it.
Wouldn't it also be because he's an older man?
Yes. He's an elder just like that. So, you want to be examples, flock as an elder. Again, going back to that example of Jesus. How did Jesus lead? Not just by telling them what to do, not by doing all the other things that Peter says not to do, but by being a great example of the servant. Verse 4. When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive unfading crown of glory. So again, there is that reward being promised here. Chief shepherd here is a word. It gets used outside of Lebanon. If you have a really big flock, you've got so many hundreds of sheep that one shepherd can't keep track of them all. So you would have multiple shepherds watching the flock. And over all of those shepherds, you would have a chief shepherd. A shepherd that's in charge of the shepherds. And of course, that is Jesus. It's not Peter, it is Jesus. So, you elders, when you exercise the job that has been given you, the responsibility that's been given you, you are not the guy that's in charge. are simply exercising leadership under the authority. This is Jesus' flock that you're in charge of. And you are his delegate. One of the things I was thinking about with regard to this, a shepherd back then was a perfectly good occupation, perfectly respectable occupation. But in let's say that you were living on a big man. So some great noble or great landowner who owns thousands of acres, has got lots of servants, they're in charge of various different things. But in that collection of servants or slaves, a shepherd is not particularly important. I mean, compared to the butler or the housekeeper or the slaves that are in the house, the shepherd is just one of those guys that's out there taking care of stuff out there. And even the chief shepherd is not all that important. He's just chief of the shepherds. So, in that sense, being called to be a shepherd is a great thing. But in the whole scheme of things, you're not being called to a really high office we're getting at. We're called, when we're called to be elders, we're called to be shepherds who are serving the flock, examples for the flock, and who are humble in the way that they do it. Peter calls for a lot of humility from these elders. But he does say, verse 4, you will receive unfading crown of glory. That's a reference to what they would do back then, rather than giving medals like they do today. They would create crowns of wreath, flowers, leaves, that sort of thing. Of course, you know what happens to leaves once they can picked. Well, flowers, once they can picked, they die. They fade. They don't stay as beautiful as they were. And that would happen to those crowns. He uses a word here for a flower that doesn't fade. The color always stays bright. And so this unfading crown is something that is very bright. It's going to stay with you. So there is a lot of reward that God has promised for those who do this job. And then finally, he also wants to pay attention to the rest of the congregation. You younger men likewise, be subject to your elders. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So this younger man is really everybody who is not an elder. It's not really just the old men versus the young men. There's a different way you could have said that. So he's contrasting the elders, those who are exercising this office that he's just describing, in comparison to everybody else. And I think he says younger men, but I think it applies to everyone, whether you're a man or not, in the rest of the church. Be subject to the elders. Which of course makes us wonder, well, does that mean something is trouble? And the answer is, yeah, probably so. You could have a church where the elder of the church is a slave outside of the church. And a young Christian could come in who's not a slave freely. And of course, that would be very difficult to be in subjection to a slave in that sense. So that would be a hard thing to do. And we struggle with it today, with being in subjection to elders. Maybe we think we don't have as much respect for the elders as we should. But Peter says, you stay in subjection to this and to the elders. And all of you clothe yourselves with humility towards each other. Peter's a guy that struggled a little bit with that in time past. He was quick to take leadership, sometimes to misuse that leadership with the other apostles. And but here he wants to make sure that they understand all of you humility from the elders towards the flock, and from the flock towards the elders. Both sides towards each other. Everybody following that example of Jesus.
Yeah, could you also consider an elder someone with longevity?
Yes. Originally, all it means is an old man. But for the most part, in many cases, as men get older, they have more experience, they have more understanding, they gain some maturity. And so in most societies, the leadership comes from the old men. And so elder becomes to be, the meaning comes to also mean the older men who lead, as opposed to just old men. And so that's really what comes. You have old men who come to have this unofficial authority because of their experience and maturity. And then we move to the third stage that we see in the New Testament of an official, appointed office of elder, which is held by men, by old men who have already achieved a certain level of maturity and experience. What's that?
And if you're appointing elders, it has to be helped by younger and older. Kids and family and study like that.
But everything it comes down to leadership and experience that older men can have.
Even if they're younger, they're older spiritual. The Bible distinguishes in Hebrews, you got people who's drinking milk and people who's eating meat.
Right.
So when you had the office of elder, this first of all, it says you have to be apt to teach.
Right.
You can't teach what you don't know.
Right.
So it has to be somebody who knows the Bible.
Right. Yeah, it includes the idea of old age, but here in the office of elder has really even more to do with maturity and faith, which doesn't tend to come with young, very young. It tends to be that to become a mature Christian, you've got to be both mature in time of the Christian, but also time